Journalists Roundtable is a half-hour discussion with Pennsylvania journalists about the week's top political news and current events. Journalists Roundtable is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to Journalists Roundtable. I'm Corey Clark, and joining me here in studio is Marc Levy from Associated Press. Also joining us remotely are Lindsay Weber from The Morning Call and Denise Clay Murray from the Philadelphia Hall Monitor. Marc, I'll start with you. We just had the budget passed after, I lost count, over 4 or 5 months late.
Yeah, 4.5 months, yeah.
So talk about that process and why it was the way it was.
Look, first, the amount of spending that Democrats wanted under Josh Shapiro's proposal was a problem for Republicans. Democrats came down and met them, and then that conversation evolved into Republicans wanted more to go along with it, and at some point said that they were perfectly willing to pass a flat-funded budget if and that to them was acceptable. Democrats wanted more money. They wanted more money for schools. There's also a big need for more money for Medicaid because states are finding out that the people left on Medicaid rolls are far sicker and more expensive to cover than they initially expected when the pandemic ended. So the state needed more money for that. In the end, Democrats made some concessions that satisfied Republicans to get the spending number up. And Democrats got some other concessions from Republicans to go along with it that made them happy. One key concession was Josh Shapiro is backing off a climate program started under his predecessor to join what we call the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, essentially an effort to limit greenhouse gases, planet warming emissions from power plants, fossil fuel power plants, coal and gas. Republicans have been opposed to this. It's been held up in court. And even though the previous governor, Tom Wolf, spent a lot of political capital on getting this passed into regulation, Josh Shapiro never fully supported it. An alternative he has in the legislature is going nowhere. And ultimately, Shapiro agreed to pull this off the books. Even though it's held up in court, he's pulling it off the books. And Republicans say that that will provide a boost to the state's energy economy, which...
You're talking about Reggie, right?
Yep, talking about Reggie.
What was their biggest problem with it?
They had a number of problems with it, but to distill it to their most recent point, they feel like it was frustrating any natural gas power plant construction for the last few years, which at the moment is more important than ever to build new sources of power because of our artificial intelligence economy is demanding more power. So if you look at what PPL is seeking, they're saying they're going to need 3 times the amount of electricity to satisfy all the data centers that want to come online in their territory. So that's just one example where the country and Pennsylvania in theory, needs more power to satisfy these data centers. And Republicans are making the point that if there is the threat of this extra cost that Reggie would impose on a power plant, generators are not going to come here. They're going to go elsewhere in the to another state that doesn't impose this extra cost to operate.
Lindsay, you spent some time in the Capitol. How does this past budget process compared to times that you've seen?
I mean, I can speak more to the local angle here because my beat is kind of specific to the Lehigh Valley. But I mean, we saw with how long this impasse dragged out 4.5 months, counties and school districts really starting to feel a financial hit. I know in Northampton County, there was some consideration of furloughs of county workers. I think they were able to find the funding so that those folks would not be furloughed. But just the fact that that was even a consideration at the county level was a huge concern for those employees.
Denise, was there a Philadelphia impact being felt?
Oh boy, was it. In addition to the school district of Philadelphia having to borrow over $1 billion to keep itself afloat while the budget was being worked out, the main thing that folks here in Philadelphia are really, really angry about is the fact that there is no money included in this budget for mass transit. SEPTA needs help. It needs money. It needs money for new train cars. It needs money to make sure people get around. And if we are honest with ourselves, in a way, this budget was the folks in upstate Pennsylvania cutting their noses off to spite their face. Because let's face it, if southeastern Pennsylvania isn't working because people can't get to and from work because the mass transit structure isn't there, the rest of the state has to rely on stuff like the farm show. And don't get me wrong, I like the farm show. I think it's a very nice event. But if you compare the farm show to the Eagles playing, in a playoff game, the tax revenue you get from those two things is two entirely different sets of money. So that's kind of what people in Philadelphia are angry about. The fact that, once again, mass transit was cut from the budget, and it was balanced at our expense.
There was funding made available, though, at some point during the process, right? That sort of kicked the can down the road to temporarily fund.
Way down the road, and the thing is, right now, regional rail is in such a state because they had to get train cars inspected at the behest of the federal government, that they've been cutting service right and left, particularly for our regional rail, which again impacts whether or not the state gets the tax ratables from the part of the state that is basically its ATM on time.
So there was also an impasse in the federal government at the same time, and around the same time was resolved. Lindsay, you wrote about the local impact of that, and I guess with food banks having increased demand and no funding.
That's exactly right. So that was a huge concern. I mean, I think the main ways in which that impact was felt was obviously people not receiving their SNAP food stamp benefits here in the Lehigh Valley and throughout Pennsylvania. I think off the top of my head, 2 million people in Pennsylvania rely on food stamps to a certain extent to, be able to afford their monthly groceries. And, when people found out that they would not be receiving that funding, food banks really saw, and food pantries saw, that increased demand. I paid a visit to a few in these past couple of weeks, and there were lines out the door. There were people showing up. They stayed open late to make sure that, folks were able to have access to the food that they need. And my understanding is that Pennsylvania, with the impasse now resolved, was able to have food stamps out the door. I think it was this past weekend. But I think even still, just with inflation and the rising cost of groceries, I think people are really feeling that. And food stamps, I think for a lot of folks, especially single folks, don't really go all that far in terms of, actually covering the amount that they need on a monthly basis to feed themselves. And so, even with that resolved, food banks and food pantries are still seeing that demand and, trying to rise to meet it, especially because there have been cuts at the USDA federal level to the amount of food that is distributed to food banks, which then distribute them to food pantries where people come to pick up that food.
Marc, the impact from the federal side that you saw?
Yeah, in addition to what Lindsay's talking about, which was widespread and deep. LIHEAP money, so money that helps low-income families pay for their electricity bill. That's being held up in Washington right now, and it hasn't been released to the states. There are millions of households that rely on this nationwide every year, and a substantial number of those are in Pennsylvania. And so the money is distributed from the federal government through the state and out to the utilities that use program criteria to determine, who should get help with their electric bill. And so what we're seeing is that people are going to have to get by this month during the cold without that aid. Now, utilities tend to have their own programs where they charge a little bit more to ratepayers and then use that money to help subsidize the bills of people who are struggling to pay them. But the bottom line is that money is behind. It normally comes out in early November, and it could be until December until that money makes it to Pennsylvania.
We're also coming off of an odd-numbered election year. All the judicial offices around the state were on the ballot. But this was a particularly noteworthy judicial election with a lot of money being thrown in. Why was there so much money in this retention election specifically?
Yeah, the nature of judicial elections has changed. This is a continuation of a trend that really seemed to begin in 2021 when you saw races for state Supreme Court in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania just blow up in terms of the amount of money being spent on them. And it's become a power struggle between the parties. And the political parties are recognizing that state Supreme Courts are increasingly a place where you could be settling fights that determine voting rights, that determine congressional maps, that determine how elections are run and who can hold power not only at the state level but in Washington. And so Wisconsin's state Supreme Court race this year cost $100 million for one seat that determined which party would have the majority, whether liberals or conservatives. That rivals what's been spent on the most expensive governor's race in this state. This year, Pennsylvania's retention election saw 3 Democrats running for re-election, essentially. They didn't have an opponent. It's a yes or no election, but the money
usually not a very well-covered thing, not a lot of money.
Yeah, it hasn't been contested by a political party maybe ever, or at least not in recent memory. This year, Republicans put money into contesting it for the first time. The retention election for 2 justices in 2017, less than $1 million was spent on it. There may not have even been a TV ad in that. In this race, the spending may have eclipsed $20 million. It's hard to track all the money, and not everything's been reported yet. But people saw ads. They were all over the air, and this was the first retention election in Pennsylvania of its kind, and certainly the most expensive.
Lindsay, there was a mayoral race in your area this time. Talk about how that came out.
Right. So that was an interesting race because we saw incumbent Allentown Mayor Matt Turk running for re-election for a second term. He faced a challenge in the Democratic primary from Ed Zuckel, who's a city councilman. Ed Zuckel lost the Democratic primary, but was able to receive enough write-in votes to become the Republican candidate on the general election ballot. But what we saw after the primary was, a lot more quiet of a campaign from both sides. I think during the primary, Ed Zuckel put up more of a fight and more effort to challenge Matt Turk versus, following during the general election. I think he kept his campaigning more low key. He also declined to debate Matt Turk in a televised debate on city issues. And then what we ended up seeing, Allentown is a pretty Democratic majority city. I don't think the city has had a Republican mayor since maybe the early 2000s, I believe. And so the results of that election were pretty resoundingly electing Matt Turk to a second term as Allentown's mayor. I think we saw him capture around 70 to 75% of the vote there.
And he's now trying to raise taxes. Does he have a mandate to do so, or how's that going over with city council?
Right. That's a good question. So last night, city council held a budget amendments meeting discussing, the amendments that they want to see to the budget, and majority of the city council voted to remove a 4% tax increase that the mayor had proposed, which he had said, was not to fund any extravagant expenses, but just to kind of keep the city afloat and continue the services that it's providing, avoid layoffs of city employees. And city council is essentially, it seems like at this point, saying no to that and asking the city to pull more money out of its financial reserves. Matt Turk is not supportive of that and says that it is poor financial management. He is considering vetoing the budget if city council were to pass it without a tax increase. So I think there will be more conversations to be had between city council and the mayor. I don't think the city has had a tax increase since 2019. So at this time, Matt Turk is saying it's necessary. City council is saying that the residents cannot afford it at this time.
And Denise, the district attorney's office was on the ballot in this odd-numbered year in Philadelphia. Can you talk about that race? Joining us live from the City Council caucus room, just so our viewers know that it can be a little busy there behind you. But tell us about the district attorney's race.
Well, Larry Krasner has been the city's district attorney for the last 8 years, and he started out as a defense attorney. In fact, he was a defense attorney that had taken the district attorney's office to court several times. So when he ran for the office and he won it, he was part of what was then considered a group of progressive prosecutors that were looking at criminal justice differently, not only looking at the need for incarceration at times, but also looking at how to avoid incarceration. So this was his third term, and he ran against a former judge, a gentleman named Pat Dugan, who had run as a Democrat in the primary, and like the mayor's race in Lehigh County, in Lehigh Valley, he got write-in votes as a Republican and decided to run as a Republican, despite the fact that he had said on the record that he wouldn't do that. It really wasn't much of a campaign. Krasner and Dugan didn't debate again after the primary, and but it did get kind of nasty toward the end because a young lady named Kata Scott was found murdered in an abandoned on a piece of abandoned school property in the city's Germantown section, and the person who was alleged to have murdered her probably shouldn't have been out on the street because he was already charged with 2 sets of violent crimes against an old girlfriend of his. And for some reason, when he came for his second set of hearings, no one said, hey, look, he's been charged with this group of crimes too. Maybe he should either have like much higher bail or he shouldn't be allowed out at all. And of course, that became a campaign issue toward the end, but it didn't really affect the outcome, which was Krasner being reelected. And some of that had to do with the fact that for the first time in this particular race, this particular off-year race, we had a turnout of above 20%. It was close to 35%. And I think that some of that had to do with the judicial retention races. Those were really top of mind here in the Philadelphia area for various reasons. So that helped, a lot in terms of turnout for the district attorney's race, even though, most of the time, if you get a 35% on your math paper, that's considered, failing math. But in terms of voter turnout here in Philadelphia, that was a passing grade.
So let's look forward to next year. It's a little bit early, but let's talk about the midterms and what's on the ballot next year. The governor's race, right?
That will be top of the ballot next year, and you'll have Josh Shapiro, presumably as the Democratic nominee, running for a second term. The Republican who is endorsed by the state party is Stacey Garrity, the twice elected state treasurer of Pennsylvania. Primaries will be next May, but she is endorsed by the party, and the filing deadline will be early next year for them. After that, there will be races for Congress, so all 17 congressional seats will be on the ballot. Most of the state legislative seats will be on the ballot. The state house is very narrowly divided. Democrats have a 1-seat advantage, so they'll be looking to defend that. In the state Senate, Republicans have a 3-seat advantage. They'll be looking to defend that. And of course, where the most money will be spent nationally is on the fight for control of Congress. And so with Republicans having a 3 or 4 seat advantage there in the U.S. House, there's hundreds of seats on the ballots nationwide, maybe about 35 swing seats, and 4 of them are in Pennsylvania. So there will be a lot of attention paid to seats in Pennsylvania and control of the U.S. House.
Speaking of which, Lindsay, the seat in your area switched parties last year, and there's already 5 Democrats lining up to take it back. Tell us a little bit about the shaping up of the Lehigh Valley congressional seat.
That's absolutely right. So Congressman Ryan McKenzie in 2024 ousted former Congresswoman Susan Wild, who was a Democrat and held that seat for 3 terms. Ryan McKenzie is running unopposed for re-election. He's been endorsed by the Republican Party already, but on the Democratic side, it's looking like things are wide open. I can try and give a brief overview of the candidates, but one of them who jumped into the race late but has received a lot of attention and endorsements is Bob Brooks. He's a former Bethlehem firefighter, and he's had some high-profile endorsements from Bernie Sanders and also Congressman Chris Deluzio, who represents the Pittsburgh area in Congress. So it seems like he's emerged as a slightly more progressive candidate. I mean, receiving that endorsement from Bernie Sanders. And he's also been drawing on his working class background as a Bethlehem firefighter. We've also seen Carol Obando Durstein. She's been endorsed by Congresswoman Susan Wild, who's been backing her campaign. And she has tried to appeal to the Latino voters in the Lehigh Valley. She's the only woman and the only Latino on the ballot. We've also seen Ryan Crosswell jump into the race. He's a former federal prosecutor under Donald Trump, but he resigned in a kind of a high-profile situation where Donald Trump's Department of Justice asked him to stop prosecuting the case against Eric Adams, despite evidence against Eric Adams for federal crimes. He resigned and had this public letter of resignation that received some public attention. So, I mean, that's not even all the candidates, but that just goes to show, how crowded the Democratic race is going to shape up to be. And there really isn't a lot of consensus about the candidates. So I think it's going to continue to be a competitive primary until, we get into the general election. It's really going to become about the Democratic message versus the Republican message.
And Denise, before we have to let you go, I think you have some city council issues. Tell us about the open seat that will be in Philadelphia next time.
Longtime legislator and Congressman Dwight Evans is retiring. He had a stroke last year, and there was concern that he was going to do this. Right now, we have at least 4 people who are currently running or talking about running. Probably the most prominent for the purposes of your office is former Democratic Chair Sharif Street. He's a state senator, and he's running for the office. And Morgan Cephas, who is the chair of the Pennsylvania delegation here, for Philadelphia, is also running. But probably one of the more, as is Chris Rabb, who is also a state legislator here. But probably the most interesting of the people that's running is Dr. Ayla Stanford. She is a doctor that during the COVID-19 crisis was one of the doctors that formed the Black Doctors COVID-19 Coalition to make sure that Black Philadelphians got access to not only COVID-19 testing, but also the vaccine when it became available. She is the one that Dwight Evans is endorsing. And what makes that interesting is this is the first time she's ever run for office. And also, it's different when you're a beloved public figure who helped save lives and, you were known for that. It's different from going to that than going into the bare knuckle brawl world of Philadelphia politics. So it's going to be interesting to see, one, how much Dwight Evans's endorsement actually helps her, and two, whether or not she's able to withstand the scrutiny that's going to come once the midterm elections start.
All right, Denise, thank you very much. Marc, before we run out of time, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about this new influx of federal money for 3 Mile Island. There's a name that we maybe haven't heard in the last few years, but now is coming back to the fore.
Right. The power plant, its owner shut it down in 2019 because they couldn't make money on nuclear power, just at least when you consider economies of scale, one nuclear power reactor wasn't making money. But now with the data center revolution, with the artificial intelligence economy, Microsoft is essentially paying the owner to reopen it. They're going to buy all the electricity, and Constellation, the owner, was going to spend $1.6 billion to reopen it. Now they're going to get a federal loan of $1 billion from the Trump administration, and it'll essentially lower their costs to reopen it, lower their borrowing costs. The bottom line is Constellation hopes to have it online again in 2027. There's a lot of approvals that go along with that. There's a lot of equipment that needs to be refurbished and replaced. But, it's a lot of power to come back onto the grid, and it's a lot of power that goes to data centers. And it also marks something of a renaissance for nuclear power, where you have a new nuclear power plant for the first time in decades coming online in Georgia. You have other mothballed nuclear power plants that could come out of retirement. And then you have a conversation about essentially miniature nuclear power plants being built in this country.
All right, well, I think we're almost out of time. I'd like to thank our guests, Marc Levy from the Associated Press, Lindsay Weber from the Morning Call, and also Denise Clay Murray, who had to leave a little bit early. Thank you for watching Journalist Roundtable. I'm Corey Clark. Good night.
Full episodes of politics and policy content like the program you just listened to are available to stream with the PCN Select app. Discover other shows like The Capitol Preview, On the Issues, candidate interviews, and more. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.